Amen. Ironically, I have a headache. Oh, come on, you guys. It's the intimacy talk. Yeah, I do a little bit have a headache, but I did find that kind of funny as I'm going to go talk about intimacy. We joked too. You've heard Mike say several times, Jen and Gary, Jen and Gary, Jen and Gary. The look on Gary's face every time Mike said it was like, oh no, no, I am not getting up there. Not until a panel. Gary's joining me at the panel. We did think when we first decided to talk about intimacy, our first idea was that Gary and I could do a dramatic reading of Song of Songs. He could play the lover, I could play the beloved, and we could just read that. You're welcome that we are not doing that. As we're talking about intimacy, we want to start just with a definition, just like we did with communication earlier. We want to start with a definition. So I looked it up. You guys, there's so many different definitions of intimacy on the web. So I took a whole bunch and kind of mushed them all together. So here's the definition we're going to work with for today. Close, connected, usually affectionate relationship requires vulnerability, openness, and trust, sharing of a variety of thoughts, feelings, and experiences, an empathic response, and deep understanding. Close relationships are part of God's will for us. In Scripture, we see it portrays the close relationship between God the Father and God the Son. It portrays that close relationship between Jesus and his followers. It also talks about the close relationships between people, like Jonathan and David and others. God created us, Mike said this last night, for intimate relationships that are open and honest without any shame. So then how do we walk in that, right? That's the trick. That sounds lovely, right? And actually making it happen is so much harder. So let's start with this. What fuels and defines our desire for an understanding of intimacy? I think there's probably more things in this. We're just going to talk about 4. But these are things that kind of form our ideas about it. So part of that is just our personality, right? Intimacy often looks different to someone who's extroverted versus someone who's introverted. Someone who's a glass half full kind of person, someone who's a glass half empty person. Our personality plays into what we think and feel about intimacy. Another thing is our family of origin. And this is a hard one, right? So this forms our definition of intimacy for good or for bad, right? So maybe you grew up in a home where at the end of the day, you had a mother and a father that came home from wherever they were, and when they connected, it was with an embrace and a kiss and really intentional time looking at each other, asking about their day. And maybe you really didn't. So if you did grow up in that home, that may now be your definition of intimacy. But if you've never seen that or experienced it, why would you ever think that that was maybe something that could happen in a relationship? So our families of origin have a huge impact on what we think about intimacy. Our personal stories. We live life and stuff happens. Stuff happens to us, stuff happens because of us, and all of those experiences have an impact on our understanding of intimacy, right? And so when we talk about intimacy, it's a marriage conference, so of course we're talking about marriage. You guys, I can't decide if I'm too cold or too warm, if I want my coat or I don't. Anyway, sorry. It's a marriage conference, so we are specifically talking about intimacy in the context of marriage, but intimacy does happen in other relationships. You can have an intimate friendship, right? So it exists outside of only marriage, but we're going to talk about it specifically within marriage. But our personal stories can have an impact on what we think about intimacy, right? So if I've had a boyfriend who didn't treat me very well, that's going to shape what I think about intimacy, or shape my desire to press into intimacy and to be willing to make myself vulnerable to actually have an intimate relationship. Our love languages, we've all heard of this, right? I'm guessing that book is back there, but I'm not 100% sure. The 5 love languages are physical touch, words of affirmation, gifts, acts of service, and quality time. All right? Now, there's conversation about there's maybe more than just that. But, so mine is quality time. My husband's is gifts of service. It's going to be really easy for us to create a definition and an understanding of intimacy that revolves around my love language, right? But Gary's is so different, and so that's going to end up looking really different. So whatever your love language may be is going to impact your definition of how you experience intimacy, what you think intimacy should look like, all of those kind of things. So I have a really close friend. Her love language was gifts, and mine is quality time. So this is just a little example for you, all right? So on my birthday, I just want to hang with people, right? I want to hang with my people. That is the definition of quality time, hanging with your people. So she knew I was going to be in her town and said, hey, maybe you can just swing by because I have this gift for you. Well, I'll be honest, I was really hurt. This was one of my closest friends at the time who knows me, who knows quality time is my love language, and she just wants me to swing by and pick up a gift. So I'm like, this is not my favorite. So we swang by and we picked up the gift, but I was maybe a little grumpy about it because I was hurt, right? And I felt vulnerable and I felt icky. Well, her love language is gifts, and she does an amazing job. She's an amazing gift giver. That just isn't how I receive love. So she was really hurt that I did not gush and ooh and ah over this lovely gift that I swang by to pick up. You guys, literally, with this friend, we ended up meeting with someone else and going through a book on friendship. So if in a friendship, our love languages can have that level of impact on our intimate relationship, right? How much more so might that be true in our marriages, right? If Gary looks at me and goes hey, babe, on your birthday, can you just swing by and pick up a birthday gift? That's not going to go well. Not for anyone involved, right? And so all of those things kind of impact our understanding of intimacy and then where our expectations are, what our thoughts are around that. What kind of things are required for intimacy? Well, vulnerability is required for intimacy. You guys, vulnerability is just really hard, right? We talk about this all the time. Our greatest desire is to be fully known and fully loved and accepted for who we are. And our greatest fear is to be fully known and rejected. And vulnerability means that we choose to step into a place where we are trying to be fully known, knowing we have no control over whether it's acceptance or rejection that we're going to end up feeling. That's why it's so hard to step into that. Authenticity is required for intimacy. If we really want to be close to somebody, if we really want to experience that level of closeness, we can't have anything that's hidden. At the end of the day, that's what authenticity is, right? We have to be fully who we are. If we have anything hidden, it creates a mask in our relationships, right? So if there's a lie that I am trying to keep to myself, that's going to automatically force me to present something that is not fully me to everybody else, all right? So we talk about masks. So if that lie creates this mask that I have to hold up and have up there, we are never going to feel fully known because no one can ever get to us. We have to be authentic. We cannot have things that are hidden to have intimate relationships. We need to understand ourselves and the other person. That has to be important to us, that we understand who we are, our strengths, our weaknesses, how we respond when we're tired, how the other person responds when they're tired. Because straight up, marriage is just a cesspool of offense ready and waiting to happen, right? At any time, something could be happening with that other person that if we don't keep in mind, I think it was Andrew that talked about this last time, like what is the grid that we're seeing the other person through? Do we have grace for them? Are we remembering in a moment when they snap at us? That doesn't mean they don't like us. Like maybe they're just having a really rough day. Or maybe you said something right before that snap that caused it too, right? So we have to be willing to understand who we are, understand ourselves, and understand our partner. Mutual respect. This is really, really important. Respect is this idea of like just acknowledging that that other person is a human, right? Made in the image of God, worthy of being treated with kindness, with gentleness, worthy of not being put down. I think this is a huge one. So I have a little bit of a soapbox about sarcasm. That is not to say you will never hear me use sarcasm, because you will definitely hear me use sarcasm sometimes. But when we're using sarcasm towards another person, that is a way of tearing them down. That it's like cloaked in this like jokey thing. But if you've ever been on the receiving end of that sarcastic comment, you know it's hard to walk away. It's hard to not hold it. It's hard to not keep believing it. And so just mutual respect. We all deserve to be treated with respect. It requires communication, both sharing and listening. So if you're the one in the relationship that is not the talker, you have to start talking. If you're the one in the relationship that talks all the time, you have to start listening. Right? Like it goes both ways, but you have to both be in that place of, I'm willing to share something with you, and I'm also willing to listen, right? Just that, the catch, the playing catch. I actually loved that example of the like playing catch versus badminton. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's amazing, right? We've all been in that situation where we're having a conversation and someone just kind of smacks it down and you're like, oh, okay, we're done. Trust is really important in intimacy. And trust is a really hard one. It takes us a long time to build. And very often, if it is broken in any way, it takes an even longer time to rebuild. Trust is one of those things that's really, really hard. I remember Brad and I were working with a couple that were really struggling in their marriage. And I was telling him, I'm like he feels like he's doing all of these things, and so why doesn't she see it? And why isn't she responding in kind? And from her perspective, it's like, well, yes, it's not that I don't see it, but I don't trust it yet, right? Like I'm still having to build that. And so he showed me this. I'm just going to use my arm, so that's going to be weird. That's fine. He showed me this picture where, so the person that has broken trust experiences their change like this, right? They're like, oh, look at how much better I'm doing. The person whose trust has been broken will not experience it to that degree. It probably looks more like this. This gap right here, that's the place for offense. That's the place that the person who's broken the trust is like, why don't you trust me more? And the other person is like, I can't, right? And so that's the area that you kind of have to work in, is in that gap. We need warmth for intimacy, right? Do we know anybody? I'm sure we all know that person, that they're just kind of cold and standoffish. It's difficult to develop an intimate relationship with someone that you feel like maybe doesn't want to be there. Right? And finally, confidentiality. This is a really, really important one. And this is true in friendships, and it's true in marriage relationships. We have to, when somebody shares something with us, we have to learn to keep that confidential. We have to learn to not share that with other people. When person A tells person B something, and then person A finds out that person C knows it because person B told them, that has an impact in the relationship between person A and person B, right? Person A is going to walk, like, we've maybe had that experience. So when there's somebody that I know, if I say something to them, other people are going to know it. I am going to change how much I say to that person. That creates an issue, right? It creates a little bit of a stumbling block in that friendship. And we can't have the same level of intimacy because I can't trust that conversation. So confidentiality is really important. And between spouses, it's even more important. You guys, we, as a spouse, we sit in the most vulnerable place with one another. When you share every piece of yourself, your body, your soul, your mind, your dreams, that is the greatest place of vulnerability. And you need to protect a level of confidentiality in your marriage and in that relationship. Now, we talked about this last night a little bit, right? But what do you do when you're having a struggle? How do I honor my spouse but still be real with people, right? I think that there are ways that we can do that and still hold our spouse's confidence. We don't have to share the things that they have said to have a conversation with somebody and have them help us through something, right? There are ways around that. And if you don't know what those might be, please come talk to us because we would love to have that conversation with you. Okay, how about some roadblocks to intimacy? We're in so much trouble. I'm only on page 1 of my notes. It's fine. Okay, roadblocks to intimacy. Fear. This is a huge one, right? So whether this maybe stems from your family of origin, it maybe stems from previous relationships, but I am so afraid of opening myself up and being rejected. You guys, I know that there are some of you in the room that are still in that place. You're in your 20s and you're still dating, right? This is or 30s or 40s, however old you might be, you're still dating. And you're here because your desire is to be in a marriage relationship and you're learning. And I love that you're investing in in that part of who you are. But every relationship that you try and step into, you make yourself vulnerable and then it doesn't work out. Plants that little seed of fear that you have to get through the next time around, right? So fear is a huge, huge roadblock to intimacy. Lack of trust. And again, even if that's not in that actual relationship, right? That intimate relationship, oftentimes we can have lost trust because of other relationships, and then we carry that in here, right? Like you've dated a guy in the past. I'm a girl, so I've dated a guy in the past, and he's treated me really badly, right? Like has not been kind. It's not fair to the next person I date, but it's really hard to not carry some of that into that new relationship and not put it on that person. Again, I'm not saying it's fair, but it's kind of human nature because we're protecting ourselves. We don't want to go through that same thing again. Insecurity. This is a huge one. So when we first got married, I struggled massively with insecurity, to the degree that we moved to Asia when we'd been married for 1.5 years, and I lived with the certainty that Gary was going to leave me at some point. This was not a fair assumption. He had not done anything to create this narrative, nothing like that. It was my own insecurities that I'd had growing up, that I struggled with that to the point that I worked through all these different ways that Gary might leave me while we lived in Asia, and I had a plan for each and every one of them. I had my exit strategy worked out. So one day, I'm praying, and God says, Jen, he's going to leave you because of all of your planning for him to leave you, not for any other reason. But you have to start trusting. You have to start watching his behavior. You have to start trusting it. You have to stop creating exit strategies, or you are never going to be fully into your relationship. My own insecurities very well could have derailed us. That was a hugely pivotal moment for us in our marriage. And I don't even think Gary knew it. Nope, he didn't know it at the time. We've talked about it since, but at the time he had no idea because he would leave. That sounds wrong. His job meant he had to go to a different city in Taiwan for 2 days every week. So I would spend those 2 days figuring out how, when he didn't come home, I was going to handle everything. And that's the thing that changed. And that then allowed us to go deeper as I released my insecurities. Lack of communication. I feel like this is maybe kind of a gimme, right? Like we just had that communication talk. If you are unable to talk with one another, your level of intimacy is going to be impacted. Criticism. I was just watching I've been watching a TV show. My husband's laughing because he knows I'm like trying to decide, do I share the show? Do I not share the show? It's Virgin River. And there are these two characters that brilliantly acted this. They were married and they were trying to come back together. But she was just critical all the time of him, of everybody else, of everything, like everything happening in life. And you could literally see this visceral, like his desire to move towards her physically, emotionally, all of that, and just an inability, like just hitting a wall every time because of that super critical spirit. This last roadblock we want to talk about is culture. Our culture is the biggest enemy to intimacy for so many reasons, right? So our culture tells us that intimacy has to look a certain way, right? Like it always looks like throwing up against the wall sex, right? Like that's the definition of intimacy. Sorry, you guys, I don't have much filter. So, or it says, women, you have to look a certain way, right? Like intimacy is reserved for women who look a certain way. Intimacy is reserved for men who make a certain amount of money. Intimacy is all about sex. It has nothing to do with anything else. All of those are messages that we hear daily in our culture. And so all of that is going in, and we cannot help but be impacted by it. It is not unless we are intentional about creating some boundaries, right? Like being able to recognize it and even say in the moment, oh, get thee behind me, Satan. Right? Like we have to start recognizing those things in culture that don't align with God's heart and be willing to kind of stand against those. So, 5 types of intimacy. Okay. Physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and experiential. What? Intimacy is not just about sex. That's so weird. Okay, because that's what we hear, right? Intimacy is equal to sex. Well, it's not. There's a lot more to it. So let's start with spiritual intimacy. Did that triangle thing work? Good, excellent. You guys, I'm not very technical, so I tried to do something and it didn't work, and that's totally fine. But if you were in Sean and Marina's breakout last night, they talked about this a little bit, about the triangle, and God is at the apex of the triangle, and the two of you are the base points. Okay, so spiritual intimacy, as you are pursuing Jesus, if that's the triangle, then what automatically happens in your relationship? You draw closer together, right? Spiritual intimacy is super important. You need individual, not just together, because if the only level of intimacy you have with God is with your partner, then it becomes the two of you thing, not just an individual thing, right? Like, so we have an individual spiritual intimacy with Jesus, but then we also have that with our spouse. If you are not pursuing God together at all as a couple, I would say, let's maybe start. It's part of God's design, right? We talked about this last night. The mission of marriage is one flesh formation. Oh, I should have tested you guys. I'm sure you would have gotten it. It's one flesh formation. And so what that means is we're trying to look more and more like Jesus, right? And so we're doing that together. Well, to do that together, we want to make sure that we have ways that we are actually doing that together. What does that look like? It may look like praying together. So Gary and I have been married for over 30 years. Yep, I'm not good with math. So, and we have struggled with praying together our entire marriage. I'm a pastor. We've struggled with praying together our entire marriage. It's just been something that it feels like we try and start, and it works great for like 5 days, and then something would happen and we would stop. And we just hadn't been able to find that rhythm. This last July, I went to a retreat and I came home and I said to Gary, I said, this is something I would really like to do. And the commitment that I had made was that I was going to pray for Gary every night, not that we were going to pray together every night. Because I think that was one of the things is I had this pressure of this like together thing that was happening. But it was requiring so much from him, right? And it's my idea that I now expect you to fully own with me. Well, we're different people. And so that's not necessarily always fair. So I made the commitment, and I'm like, I'm going to pray over you. Well, that has turned into we take turns praying over the other at night. We are not doing I'm praying for our kids. We pray for our kids other times. Or situations or anything like that. It is literally, oftentimes at night, I just pray that his spirit would be prominent over his mind and body as he sleeps. And that God, you would speak to him, and that if you give him a dream, that you would wake him up and help him remember. That's where it started. It can be simple. I think sometimes we make it really, really, really hard. You guys, you could read a YouVersion. Yeah, like you could do a YouVersion plan together. There's ways that you can do it together, and you can like comment, and you can see each other's comments because you're doing it like as a group on YouVersion. Clearly, I do this incredibly well, and you should definitely come to me for all of your technical questions about YouVersion. But there are others in the room that could help you much better than I with that. But that's a way to pursue spiritual intimacy together. You know, I love the picture in Genesis. So this is before sin enters the world. This is right after sin enters the world. Sin enters the world, and Adam and Eve are now both, they know that they're naked, right? Like they have an understanding of nakedness that they did not before, and they are feeling shame. And when they hear God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, they hide. So there's some things that we can infer from this. We can infer that this is not the first time God has shown up walking in the garden in the cool of the day. It's this picture that before sin, you had man and woman walking with God at the end of the day, just chatting about how things had gone. Man and woman are naked, holding hands, just sharing with each other and with God, right? Like it's this beautiful picture that sin broke, but we can still today have those moments. Have a relationship with each other and with God where we are fully exposed, walking hand in hand, sharing with Him, listening to God, listening to our spouse. We can bring heaven down to earth and have those moments today. Are we going to live in it 24/7? Probably not. But I don't know, once a month? That sounds good, right? Sorry, maybe more than once a month. Sorry, see? I told you would hear sarcasm sometimes. Here's one thing I'm going to say about spiritual intimacy to those of you who are single. Spiritual intimacy is super, super potent. Like praying with somebody that you're dating, like it can make you feel really, really close, really close. So if there are other types of intimacy that you are trying to not step into, I think it's a really good thing to know that spiritual intimacy might actually make that a little harder. So I'm not saying don't pray together, but maybe be wise about where and when that happens, right? Maybe not in a car out on a back road. That's maybe not the best place for spiritual intimacy because it might lead to other things, all right? The other thing I'm going to say is this, okay? Especially to you ladies, I'm not saying it's not men, but especially to you ladies. There's some guy that wants to pray with you. Like if you're pursuing Jesus, right? Like you've just hit the jackpot. It can hide some yellow and red flags in some of the other areas of intimacy. It can kind of blind you to some things, other things that are happening that maybe aren't all that healthy. So spiritual intimacy is super, super important. And also, just a couple of warnings for those of you that are single. I read this quote on a blog. It said, spiritual intimacy also provides a bit of grace for all other forms of intimacy. It is important to prioritize all types of intimacy, but if spiritual intimacy is high, then the other types of intimacy will have a natural resiliency. Remember when Mike was talking last night about the deformed, right? Like in the metal that has elasticity. So in this area of intimacy, if you have a strong spiritual intimacy in your marriage, I think you'll have a little bit more elasticity when some other area of intimacy is maybe getting a little deformed. Does that make sense? Okay. Intellectual intimacy. Oh, you guys, I'm going to talk so fast. This is the idea of being able to have a conversation together. We need to be able to talk to each other. Every moment of our marriage cannot be about either like doing something fun or having sex, right? Like there's a whole lot of time in between all of those things that you want to be able to have a conversation with each other about anything. Current events, sports, theology, the PTA meeting. Like there are so many different things that we have to potentially talk about. You don't have to have the same interests, but what you do have to have is an interest in the interest of the other. Does that make sense? Right? So when Gary and I first started dating, he was a big baseball fan, and his team is the LA Dodgers. Yes. Good job, family. And we started dating in '88, which the Dodgers won the World Series that year. So they had been having a great year, and when we started dating, they were in the NLCS. I feel like it was during the NLCS. So they were in the middle of the championship series. So I was dating this cute boy. So I learned a lot about baseball super fast. Right? It's what we do. When we start dating with somebody, I think we're better at this at the beginning of a relationship than we maybe are continuing on later in our relationship. We're interested in the things that the other person is interested in. We're willing to put a little time and effort into learning. I would listen to sports radio in the car so that I could, try and have something to say about the baseball game. I think the longer we're married, we start to let some of that stuff go. So intellectual intimacy is just that idea of like being able to have a conversation, caring about what they think about. And if this is something you're like, I don't even know if that exists in our marriage, here's an idea, all right? Set a date, listen to a podcast, watch a Bible Project video, watch a show on National Geographic about national parks, whatever you may be interested in, like do that thing together and then have a conversation about it. Like, what did you see? What did you hear? What did that make you think? What did that remind you of? Questions like that. Practice, right? I think it was Kathy on the panel last time talked about these are muscles that we need to work out and we need to practice to have an expectation. If this is an area you're like, I don't even know if we do that, and you sit down and you're like, well, we better be amazing at it the very first time, like you may be disappointed and not ever try again, right? Like if you looked at your child that's learning how to walk, like he doesn't get up on his legs and then fall down and you go, oh man, loser. Phew. Really thought you could do that. Well, I guess not. And never do it again. And yet that's the expectation we have of ourselves, especially as adults, when we're trying something new. So in all of these areas of intimacy, if you're like, I don't know if we do a ton of that, and you want to try and practice, don't expect yourself to be an expert right out of the gate, because that's just not real, okay? Experiential intimacy, just having shared experiences, adventuring together. We need opportunities to laugh together. We need shared moments of wonder. We need memories that we can kind of revisit. Last night, we had to take apart our bed. We just recently moved. Sorry, rewind. We just recently moved. In the process of that, we are selling some of our furniture and getting new furniture, and we had people coming to pick up bedroom furniture today. So we had to take the bed apart last night. And so we had this shared experience we realized we've never actually built or unbuilt this bed before. So we removed the mattresses, and we're like, well, now what? And you just grab the tools, and you start going and try and figure it out as you go. Like, that's a silly little example maybe, but like those shared experiences, right? Anyone tried to build an IKEA furniture piece? Okay? If you did and you're still married, good job. Because that is super challenging, right? And most of us have really funny memories and stories from trying to build a piece of IKEA furniture. Those are great, all right? Ecclesiastes 9, 7 through 10 in the Message says this: seize life, eat bread with gusto, drink wine with a robust heart. Oh yes, God takes pleasure in your pleasure. Dress festively every morning. Don't skimp on colors and scarves. Relish life with the spouse you love, each and every day of your precarious life. Each day is God's gift. It's all you get in exchange for the hard work of staying alive. Make the most of each one. Whatever turns up, grab it and do it, and heartily. This is your last and only chance at it, for there's neither work to do nor thoughts to think in the company of the dead, where you're most certainly headed, as we all are. I just loved that idea of, as a couple, like, grab life. Grab it with gusto. You don't have to wear bright colors and scarves if you don't want to, right? But just enjoy life. Look for those opportunities to have experiences together. Emotional intimacy. You guys, I'm sorry, I'm talking so fast. Here's the one thing that I want to just break down in the room really quick, because there's a stereotype with emotional intimacy that I think it's important for all of us to let go of, and that is this. Men want sex, women want emotions. Okay? Now, I'm not saying men don't want sex, and I'm not saying that there aren't men that want sex more than emotions, but also to say that all men only want that and all women only want this is unfair to both men and to women. All right? Yes, there are those of us in the room that have a deep-seated need for sex. Obviously, that question came up not even in the intimacy section. So clearly, that is the case. And yes, there are people in the room that need a deep emotional connection more than others. Again, this comes back to understand yourself and understand your spouse, because then that's a conversation that you're going to work through, right? Like, one of the things that I think we didn't maybe talk about earlier with if one of you wants sex more than the other, and we're just going to go with the one of you, not make it men, is oftentimes when you have that conversation, you're going to land in a place where you're probably not having as much sex as you would like, and you're probably having more sex than you would like, right? Like, that's probably the healthy place to land. For either of you to force the other person to your position is an unhealthy dynamic in your marriage. to have a conversation about where could we find middle ground is a healthy way of handling that in your marriage. Emotional intimacy is the ability to share your feelings with each other, your dreams. But it's not just you sharing, it's also you being able to listen. It's really important, especially if your spouse looks at you and says, I have this dream, and you do that badminton move, right? And you're like, oh, gotta go get dinner on. Are they gonna come to you with their dreams again? Emotional intimacy is that willingness to step into that space, to hold space for that other person, for their thoughts, for their feelings. It doesn't always have to be like super emotional, right? So that's the thing that I thought. I am a very emotional person. We all know that. If you've been around at all, you probably know that about me. My husband is a slightly less emotional person. I love that some of you giggled. So when we got married, right, like I come in hot. All of a sudden I'm like, yes, there's this person that I get to dump every emotion on, and they're gonna hold it with me, and they're gonna meet me in that exact same space, and that's gonna be amazing. And my poor husband is like, like what is happening? Right? Like that was a super unfair expectation, and that's not what emotional intimacy is. It's not me just being able to dump and him just like having to take it, or him having to become like a crying mess like I am. Just because I cry at Henry Weinhard ads does not mean my husband needs to cry at Henry Weinhard ads. And yet, there's something in our brain that makes us think that, right? Like for me to be emotionally intimate with my spouse, they have to meet me at my same place of emotional level. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that you have to both be equally invested to the same degree. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look exactly the same. Does that make sense? Okay. So emotional intimacy. It's also about a lot of the one another's, right? The one another's in the Bible, yes, they play out in the body of Christ. They play out in our marriages too. Forgive one another, carry one another's burdens, be kind to one another. All of that plays out in the marriage relationship also, and all of that is emotional intimacy. Okay, physical intimacy. 4 minutes, excellent. That's plenty of time. Okay, physical intimacy is a lot more than just sex. Can we all agree on that? All right, excellent. I know I've been at marriage conferences in the past and with some people that were in a crisis point in their marriage and could barely look at one another, let alone wanted to touch one another. And their homework assignment was to hold hands for 5 minutes once a day. Because sometimes that's where the physical intimacy has to start. Physical intimacy is one of the biggest pieces of intimacy that get hurt by our stories and culture, right? As we age, so as women, the expectation is that we look super hot all the time so that our husband wants to have sex with us. Well, then we hit 40 and we put on a few pounds, and there's nothing we can do to get them off because just aging. And then we hit 50. And the message that we're now hearing is you are no longer worthy of being desired. That's a huge problem. Our stories. 1 in 4 women have dealt with some sort of sexual assault. That's going to more than likely have an impact on the physical intimacy in your marriage. It can't help but that. Mike talked about this a little bit last night too. I think it was him, where he talked about so if you grew up in the church, he talked about the purity movement, which I did. I grew up in the church, and I grew up hearing sex, bad, 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 except in marriage. I didn't hear it was bad altogether, but definitely bad outside of marriage to the degree. But then, well, you're married now, so flip the switch, sex is good. So that's not great. Most women that I have talked to that grew up, and that is their reality, struggled when they stepped into their marriage. You guys, it's just there's no switch. That's a lovely idea, but there's not a switch. Like there's a long journey in one direction, not a switch. So that may be the thing that's impacting your physical life. The circumstances of life have a huge impact very often on our physical intimacy. Now, I know that for some, when all of the world is going to hell in a handbasket and everything feels like chaos, the way and place that you find safety and connection, both with your spouse and with your God, is in the act of making love. God bless you, because I think it's a relatively small percentage of people that is true of. And more often than not, crisis comes, storm comes, and sex is the thing that goes out the window. And then you're trying to figure out, how do we get back there? And that's not an easy thing. Physical intimacy is really, really important. Physical intimacy in all of the ways is really, really important, right? The kiss in the kitchen, holding hands in the car on your way to dinner, when you're at that stand-up party that's always so awkward, right? Like anytime Gary comes up behind me and puts his hand on my back, sorry. That's all of those things are important. And also, making love is important. So if that's something that's kind of left your marriage, my encouragement is this: we need to pursue healing in that area in whatever way that looks like, right? So if making love is difficult because of a hard piece of your story, because there's maybe been somebody that's done something to you that you did not want, and that's the thing that's impacting that, I would say go to counseling for your own self and for your marriage. If it's other things, I would say, figure out ways to work through this. All right? Now, the person who is not the one with the struggle, you need a level of grace in this that can only come from God. Because it's hard to walk with somebody when it's something that you desire and you're excited about in your relationship and it's not happening. It's really, really hard to keep walking that out. You're going to need the help of God to kind of figure that out. But you guys, you need to have the conversation. That's another thing. Growing up in the church, you don't talk about sex. You don't even, right? You definitely don't talk about it here. But I kind of learned you also don't really talk about that with your spouse. That was kind of a foreign concept. All the pieces of, this is why it's hard, this is what I like. All of those are conversations that we should have, because physical intimacy is a gift that God gave us. He created it for us. And he's told us it a little bit shadows that idea of the relationship between Christ and the church, which is weird and a little hard for us to wrap our head around. But if that's true, how much more important is the act of making love in the context of our marriages? Okay. Let's do this. How to pursue intimacy. Here are some tips and tricks, because I really like to leave on a practical note. All right? How to pursue intimacy. Number one, just be present. Be present. Put your phone down. You guys, our phones are one of the biggest enemies to our intimacy. Learn more about them. How do they feel connected? How can you connect with them? What makes them happy? What makes them sad? Just learn more about your spouse. Practice gratitude for them and show it. If you are struggling with intimacy, so can I say something really quick? Oftentimes, I think that we have this idea, if we are struggling to feel connected and like we're not as intimate with our partner as we'd like to be, our answer is, well, let's have sex. So I'm just going to say, very often that is not the thing that necessarily works, because all 5 of these pieces of intimacy are super important. And so if all we're doing is focusing on one, no matter what the one is, whether the one is spiritual intimacy or physical intimacy or emotional intimacy, we're still going to be out of balance. So we want to focus on all of them. So practicing gratitude and saying that to them is one of those ways that we can kind of increase intimacy, and it helps us see our partner for who God created them to be. Ask questions that spark deeper conversations. I think we're all trained to just ask yes/no questions all the time, right? But if instead we ask a question that like invites more response than just a yes or a no. Make space for each other for shared experiences, for conversation, and for private time. Or business time. Yeah, I don't know if any of you have seen that video. That may be aging me, but I don't care because it's hilarious. So you can ask about that later if you don't. Identify and share your emotions. This is really important. But if this is something that you haven't done, start with something small, okay? Because again, these are all muscles that we have to practice. Don't try and start with like the big, huge thing, right? That's maybe not the best place to practice. Like, talk about how you feel about the color red, right? Like I'm saying, like, make it that innocuous. Don't make it be about, like, I was abused as a child and this is how I felt. If you've never shared your emotions before, that's not the place to start. We want to build up to that because that's a deep wound that carries a lot with it, right? Become a really good listener. A really good listener repeats back. I just heard you say this. Is this what you meant? A really good listener asks clarifying questions. A really good listener listens without thinking about what you're going to say in response. That's a hard one. Cut out distractions. Whatever the distractions to your marriage may be, okay? Like, if your marriage is suffering because you're on a soccer team and you go and you play 3 nights a week, so you never have time together with your spouse, I don't know. For now, maybe the soccer needs to go. Whatever a distraction might be, all right? Finally, pray together. If this is a hard one, if you've never done this before, I'm going to give you a really simple way to start. There's an app called Lectio 365. It's done by 24/7 Prayer, and I would encourage you to download that app. This is a great way to start towards spiritual intimacy because you can just play it and listen to it together. Neither of you have to say a thing. All right? So it's a really good place to start. We're talking about practicing, right? I know in this room, we're all at different places with all of these types of intimacy. So so that's a really good way to start. Okay, yep, I'm going to invite the panel up. All right, you guys know there's Slido? Yep, there's more Slido. So all your questions about sex and all the other kinds of intimacy, right? You guys have been using Slido, so you know how to do this. So joining me is my husband, Gary, Bill and Donna Burrow. I almost just mixed up the letters. It said Dill and Bonna. That's weird. And then Greg and Lynn Bruce. If any of you got to go to Greg and Lynn's breakout earlier. Yeah, thanks. Right? Yes, yeah. It's difficult to know.
All right, we're going to jump in, and I'm just giving you guys a second here. We have some questions that came in even before we regathered here. I'm sure many of you were probably having conversations over lunch, which was great. So I'm going to look on here. We're going to start with a question that was given, and it's the top of the list right now, and it may not exactly have to do with just intimacy, but let's start with this question. And what I'm going to try to do, we got a lot of questions on here, so we'll try to make our way through them. But the first one is this: what's the single biggest thing in your marriage that pulls you apart from your spouse and your alignment with Christ? And how do you correct that afterwards?
That sounds really hard, but it's me. That's the answer. It's me. That selfish old guy, it's me. That's our biggest deal.
Anybody else want to jump on that one?
Yeah, I was just it's pretty much the same, but I was gonna say when I'm not dying to myself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good.
If I make anything just about me, it's kind of out the window.
Yeah. Yep. Bill.
These guys are more spiritual than me. So when our kids left the home, our arguments fell off a cliff in terms of frequency. We were aligned in how we were raising our kids. We loved our children and all that kinds of stuff, but we are now in the empty nester phase, and it was amazing how many of our arguments were around who was doing what with, the kids or getting things done, or how to get my son through high school, who had a learning disability and did not enjoy school and academic activities, although he turned it on in college, which was great. There was a switch. We didn't know where it was. We obviously were pushing the wrong buttons, but that made a huge difference. And it wasn't until they left that it's like, oh my gosh. And actually the research supports this. They find that marital satisfaction actually plunges when you have children. So it's not that children are bad, it's just that it adds another dynamic into the family that has to be managed along with all the other things that are going on.
That's good. Let's jump through. I see some orders of questions, but I'm going to try to be intentional and move around here. So here's a question: what's the best sex advice you've ever received? Best sex advice you've ever received.
Don't look at me. I don't have. Don't wear flannel. I don't know. Let's talk about that. Let me think.
Go? No?
No, I've got nothing.
This is avoiding the question, but it's still really important to what I do as a ministry, is that we don't get that kind of advice from our parents. We don't get that kind of advice from church. When we got married, it was kind of like you were talking about, don't. And then what do they give you for a wedding present? The joy of sex. And that's supposed to fix everything. And it just doesn't. And so I don't want to be Debbie Downer, but, we need to do better. We need to do better with that. So I don't have an answer for what sex advice, because I didn't get any.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
I would encourage women and men both to make the bedroom a sanctuary. I think one of the best things we did was that our children, we have 4 of them, we're not allowed to play Legos in our bedroom. And so we kept the toys out, and so we just kept the bedroom, I wouldn't say private, because they were allowed in there, but it wasn't their playground. So.
Yeah. And it was beautiful. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a couple of things. And I got this advice later in life because, yes, I did not get sex advice from my mom. That's not something that happened. So here's a couple of things. Number one thing that had a huge impact on our sex life was when I did a Bible study called Blessing Your Husband, and I started praying daily for my husband. Not the prayer of make Gary into the man I want him to be, but God, make Gary into the man you want him to be, and help me to see that, and made the commitment to pray that 5 times a day. That had an impact on our sex life, whether Gary knew it or not. Okay. So another thing was this is if you are not feeling like it, right? Like we know this. There's the verse that, I didn't go into this, but there's the verse that our bodies are not our own. Mike mentioned that earlier. And yes, it has been weaponized. And in fact, in my notes when I talked about that, I'm like, okay, then also you have to read all of the passages about thinking of the other more than yourself and walking in humility and, right, like, because it's easy to take that passage and make it about, like, well, I should get what I want. But if you look at all of Scripture, that is definitely not the thing that God is saying. And so knowing that I should be ready and willing, and sometimes I don't feel like it, right? Like I literally have a headache, or it's been a long day, or whatever. Praying and asking God to help me be willing and to desire my husband. Not that the desire didn't exist, but right, like the in the moment desire. Lastly, several of us have gone to a marriage conference where part of the homework was that you just slept naked and you made the commitment to have sex 5-7 nights. What was it? Like a week?
35 nights. It was the 40 days. It was like the 40 days of sex. There was a church that did that. I'm dead serious. I don't know what conference you guys went to, but there was another one. It was 40 days of sex.
Except, yes, you do.
It was seriously.
It was lamb. There was the dance, and there was the naked sleeping. Anyway, so try that. Try naked sleeping.
Or don't.
I'll give it some advice that I heard, and I think this will make sense. Years ago, we didn't have time to get into it in this conference, but when you understand, it's interesting. I work with a lot of young adults. I'll just give an example. Working even with Trailblazers, we do chapels, and every year I'll do about 6 or 7 games in a row just on dating, relationships, all these. It's the number one most requested, hands down. And one of the things that we talk about is this idea that what do women need, what do men need? And it's stereotypical, I understand that, but sometimes stereotypes are for a reason. There's data to show, there's things, and there's narratives within narratives and all that kind of stuff. But let me just say this, stereotypically, the number one need that a woman desires in a relationship is safety. So if you are saying, again, this is stereotypes, but the advice that was given to me, and this is what I pass on to men, the best way that you can make your wife feel safe is your relationship with Jesus. What a woman will feel most safe around in the relationship is when she knows her husband pursuing Jesus. Because when your husband is pursuing Jesus, you feel safer that he's listening to God, that he's in touch with the Lord. You feel safer emotionally. You feel safer like when he's gone, what's he up to? Who's he seeing? Well, if he's pursuing and loving Jesus, I just feel safer when he's even not around, right? And so the best sex advice I can give you is, and this is going to sound really bad, it doesn't solve everything, but you pursue Jesus. If your wife feels safe, chances are she's going to want to feel safer to give herself to you, if that makes sense. So like I tell guys this all the time. I said at the men's retreat, one of the most attractional things to your wife is you and the Word. I think a guy in the Word to a woman is foreplay. Like, I know it's weird, but if you think about that, and funniest story, I was down in LA, went for a walk, we were for a conference, literally this literally happened, no joke. I was walking down to the pier because I wanted to pray in the morning before the conference, just some quiet time with the Lord. I have my Bible with me, I'm going out there, I'm going on the pier in the water, reading, praying. As I'm walking back, a woman was sitting there on the side of the road on a park bench. I'd never met her in my life, never seen her. As I'm walking by, this woman looks at me and goes, You have your Bible? Ooh, you so sexy. You guys remember I shared it at the men's retreat. So I think the best sex advice, that literally did
carry your
happen. So
Bible?
like, so take your Bible to bed with you. You never know what will happen. Okay. Just saying. There you go. Okay, let's move on to some other ones. Here's a question that's similar to that, though. But how much sex is normal and healthy? It's a good question. How much sex is normal and healthy? Let's hit that one, then we'll keep bouncing through some of these. Anybody want to jump on that one?
Bill.
So, some of you don't know who I am. So I'm a licensed psychologist. I work at George Fox University, and I've taught graduate level doctoral courses on human sexuality, sex dysfunction, sex therapy. So unfortunately, I know a lot of data. Or fortunately, depending on your perspective. So one of the things we know that is the more educated people are, the less sex they have. Did you know that?
Say that again, Bill.
The more educated people are, so the more years of education somebody has, the less frequently that couple will have sex. Now, I can't tell you why. I have my theories of why that is. But that's one thing. There's averages. Averages really don't tell a story, right? Because there's seasons of life too, right? So depending on, whether you have kids or not, what stage of development the children are at, how are both people working? Is only one working? Are people working, 8 hours a day or 12 hours a day? All those kinds of things factor into this. So you're likely, I'll tell a story. So a friend of mine was a psychologist in Connecticut, and he told a story about a couple that he was seeing. This couple was in their 60s or 70s, and they were just terribly concerned about how their sex life wasn't nearly as vibrant as it had been before. So he asked them, he said, well, how frequently are you having sex? And they said, well, we're only having sex about 6 or 7 times a day.
A day?
A day. And it took all he had to not react as the therapist to this answer to his question. And he's like, so what were you doing? And it was more than that, but they were terrified that it was down to 6 or 7 times a day. So you're always going to find someone that is higher than your number or lower than your number. And what's not important so much as the number is, going to some of the things that Jen was mentioning earlier, is have you guys kind of met in the middle, and are both people happy enough with how frequently it's going to be? And it doesn't have to be the same number every week or the same nights every week, right? It can vary depending on what's going on, but it actually, the answer to the question, if you want to look at averages nationally, it depends on these other factors in terms of what the actual sort of average is.
We have a friend that they do this, and I know some of you are like, that's the worst thing ever, but hear me out. But they actually plan their weekly schedule for sex night. Absolutely. They'll say like Thursday night, they know is sex night. Now, I know somebody's like, well, where's the spontaneity? But if you understand and complexities of like busyness and all those things, but what it did was it actually took the pressure off both of them. And because they both knew, and it worked for them. The point is what everybody's saying here is sometimes you got to find out what works for you. And just like, again, some of you might be like, hey, let's try that. That might be something for us. And some of you guys, that doesn't work for us. But I think what Bill's saying too, and what you've heard is like, figure out, communicate what works for you guys. And don't see it as like right or wrong or comparing to others. They'll rob you. Let's go to the next question too, because there's a lot bouncing in here. Next one is this. How do you come together when one spouse needs physical in order to be emotional, and one needs emotional to be physical? How do you come together when one needs to be emotional in order to be physical and physical to be emotional? Anybody want to answer that one?
Be the one that chooses to do the thing the other person needs. One of you has to bend. Otherwise, you're just stuck all the time. And so be the one that chooses to do the thing the other wants, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. As I think about what does it mean, not just to be a wife and a mother and that kind of thing, but what does it mean to be a Christian? And what it means to be a Christian is to submit to one another. And there are times in our marriage where, and I'll just admit, Bill always wants it more than me. But I know, because I want to please him, and because I love him, and because I know that I need to, okay, I'm going to do it on a night that maybe I'm not feeling completely like I want to do it. But that's what love is. Love is sacrificial. Love is doing something that's hard. I look at what Jesus did. He died on the cross. He sacrificed his life for me. That's what love is. And so there are a lot of things. Bill sacrifices himself for me, not necessarily in the sex realm, but in other areas. And this is one area that it's harder for me to want it as much as he does, but I need to sacrifice. And we do. We have conversations every season of life. We revisit this conversation of frequency, and we come up with a new normal, and then we have to revisit it again. So just because you've had the conversation early on doesn't mean you're not going to have to revisit it continually during your marriage. And do it. Don't let it go without revisiting it if something's bothering you. Otherwise, you have a lot of resentment that builds up, and now you have to work through the resentment. So, and we've learned that too.
We've had to work on rebuilding our marriage for several years. And so during that time, Greg was not allowed to demand that from me, although demand is too strong a word. He wasn't allowed to ask even. And so probably until recently, it was only if I ever initiated it. And after the trust was broken, it took a long time before I ever wanted to initiate it. So I'm just saying that it doesn't look like a consistent thing when trust has been broken. It may be a long time. And he lived. He didn't die because he didn't have sex. So, I don't know, kind of eye-opening perhaps, I don't know.
Go ahead.
Gentlemen, hang on to your seats, because I'm going to throw you under the bus. You will not die if you do not get sex. And I say that with all sincerity because I believed that in my addiction. I would never have physically spoken it out loud, but I distinctly remember the day that it soaked into my little brain that I wouldn't die if I didn't go act out today. I guarantee you will not die. And when you die to yourself on your wife's behalf, this all changes. And yes, we have a certain perspective. And if you haven't been where we are, then things look different and all these things. But for those of you who have been there, you won't die. I guarantee you, you will not die. You can figure out how to work this out with your spouse, and it will be glorious and wonderful. And I just want to say thank you for your talk. I thought that was so spot on tonight. Thank you.
I'm going to move us to a couple other questions. And I think that on that note, when that passage we referred to, when Paul said, don't withhold, it's interesting. How many of you have ever heard the passage when Jesus was questioned about giving, and Jesus said, render unto Caesar's what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God? How many of you have ever heard that before? The same Greek word for render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God, is the same word render that's used when Paul says, render the affection to your spouse that they deserve. And there's a sense of understanding that God's wired us, that like we have to understand that need is meant to be met in marriage. God wired us that way. So when you say render unto God what is God, render under Caesar what is Caesar's, there's also render under spouse what is due to them in a sense. So when the marriage is healthy, this works. When it's not healthy, then it doesn't. And that's why you have to work through those things. But what's funny in that same passage, different translations, this is crazy, will say in that passage, some translations will say, give sex out of benevolence. Which is like, that's what we call charity sex, right? You've heard that statement before. And sometimes in marriage, it feels like that. Grab Bible Gateway, look up that one passage and look at all the translations. That's a fun date night for you. There's other translations I won't get into, but it's so much fun. So there you go. I love just, you know what? God's word is so amazing to give us a vision for all these things. Okay, here's a question that I think has come up. I'm going to try to capture a few of these. One of these is this. I'm going to try to take a few of these questions and form it to one question. Obviously, you know, you have kids, and that can make things challenging. Not always in a bad way. It's just that, like for instance, obviously moms, when you are first having newborns, right? There's a time there has to be a reset in your body. Obviously, we know that. But sometimes that's longer for each woman. It's different. So there's all kinds of new nuances that are added to that, right? That impacts your intimacy. And then as kids get a little bit older, like toddlers, you're still like devoting to them the time and energy. Now you have this new energy level that's impacted that, right? And then as kids grow older, there's interruptions and then, you know what I'm saying, there's stages of this. So how do you guys find, what are healthy ways that as kids enter into the scene, they're a gift from God, so we're grateful for them, right? But how can you still create intimacy, be intentional in that season of your married life? What does that look like for you guys? Have you guys done some things? Is there ways you can give some input on that?
I have a generic answer. When you look at all the things that are involved in your life, at any stage of life, the things that you prioritize are the things that get done. Mm-hmm. It's just the reality. So I am older than I used to be. I still like to play basketball and play tennis and those kinds of things. It is the first thing I put in my appointment book every day of the week. And I block out more time than I need to do it. Now, it doesn't happen every day of the week, right? I've got a job and I work long hours. But I put it in first because it's something that I want to prioritize. I think it's good for me. It's just good it's good physically to do it. It's good for my mental health and all those kinds of things. So part of the answer to the question, at least I think, is and let's take it outside of just sex, if relationship with your spouse is a high priority, it has to be scheduled in first. Mm-hmm. When our children were coming on the scene and we got exposed to some material, and one of the things that they said, which we actually bought into this, is that the primary relationship in a marriage is the husband and wife relationship, and children are welcome guests. And if you keep that in perspective and don't let the children become the central focus, and it's hard because when they're tiny, they have lots of needs. You know, I mean, they're basically a 10-pound digestive tract. So. And they coo and ooh and look at you and all that kinds of stuff. They're not really communicating, but we like to believe they are. So there's a lot of care and nurturing, and that care and nurturing continues for years and years. It takes on different forms. So, but if you make that husband, so like as our kids got to be like, you know, preschool, grade school, that kinds of stuff, we would eat dinner. They would want to get up and leave the table. So we'd let them, you know, take their dishes over to the counter. They would go in the family room, but they weren't allowed back. We just said, no, and if they came back, no, you asked to be excused. You've been excused. Go play. Mom and I are talking. And it, you know, maybe it was for 3 minutes. I don't know. But I mean, we did it. It was a priority. And that was, because before kids came on the scene, dinner was when we would sit and talk. And then all of a sudden, children got there, and there was a lot of talking going on. There wasn't much conversation at our dinner table, because everybody in our family talks at once. So I think you prioritize the relationship, and then sex would be a subsection of that relationship, right? You decide, okay, how are we going to keep this part of our relationship alive, given that we've now got more demands on our time?
And so I want us to distinguish between romance. We have this world that is all about the romance of everything, and spontaneity is one of those romantic things, right? And that's going to happen at times in your marriage. But if you're in the marriage for the long haul, it is a long road of, there's not going to be that much spontaneity, especially if you're parents. So I think you need to step out and say, I'm not going to let this romantic view of sex rule my life. I'm going to schedule it. Or we're going to have a conversation and look at our calendars this week and determine, like, I don't like to have sex on Tuesday nights because I have to get up really early Wednesday morning and prepare. A lot of times I'm teaching on Wednesday mornings. And so when we're and I guess that might be TMI, but when we're trying to think of our weeks, I don't like to do it on Tuesday nights. Once in a while I will, but that's just kind of the way we work things out. And so, but you know what? It's fabulous because I know when it's going to happen. I know when it's coming. And you're right. It takes the pressure off. Well, are we going to do it tonight? Are we not going to do it tonight? Someone's feelings are going to get hurt.
Who's the soft one?
Your feelings are going to get hurt. Yeah, no, it's always your feelings. So anyway, think it's okay to schedule. Now, there's going to be spontaneous times, and go for it. But one of the reasons I firmly believe that Bill got me season tickets to the Broadway shows is because he knew at least 6 times a year he was probably going to have sex that night. So 6 or 7, right? 6, yeah.
Smart man.
We've started getting tickets to Portland Center Stage as well. Picked up 3 more nights.
And then, the Oregon Symphony. We have the Christmas shows happening this year. So he's not dumb. I mean, I'm really kind of.
That's good.
All that to say, it's okay to schedule it in. It actually works really well for us, and it takes a lot of the pressure off.
You know, when our kids were little, yeah, they're not little anymore. So once this plays into the conversation last night about cheap date nights. We would have a normal evening with them. We would feed them dinner, all of that. They would get to bed, and then we would have dinner, which plays into maybe a lot of the different types of intimacy that exist, right? Because that could maybe lead into physical intimacy, but if nothing else, we felt closer. And it was an easy thing to do when the kids were little. And when the kids got older, we just started locking the door. You guys, just lock the door. And sure, it's super awkward the next morning if your kid looks at you and goes like, hey, why was your door locked? And you're like, you know what? Sex is a normal part of marriage, and you're going to get to enjoy it when you're married. So we're going to lock the door sometimes. Just lock your door.
On that note, though, I would say this. Your kids definitely, hear this right, your kids definitely, and this goes with the question here, because some of you are asking what's the best way to model and teach your kids about sexuality. So this is a good segue into that. Like, how do you because culture's got a whole different way. They're just inundated with how culture says sexuality should look like. So as you're discipling your kids around a sexual ideology and theology and life and all of those things, the question here is, how can you guys, this is the question you guys, what's advice you can give to families and parents who are trying to raise their kids with having a healthy view of sexuality? But I would say, as you're thinking of that question, to what Jen just said about locking the door, I would say is your kids don't need to know details about your sex life. They need to know you're having sex. So, figure out what that looks like, because, when they know that you guys are doing great in a marriage, that provides safety and security in the home. Does that make sense? So, and I think we oftentimes, again, we've been doing it for the sake of this conversation. We're just defining intimacy and physical intimacy as sex. There's so many ways to have physical intimacy. That's not just actual sex. So that's a whole nother thing. So back on the question, you guys, what's parental advice to parents here who are trying to raise kids with that understanding of what does a healthy sexuality look like? What advice would you give parents?
We started by, when they would identify body parts, we started using the proper words, like the scientific words. We used penis, vagina. So we started doing that. And then I know our kids, we locked the door and they would try to get in. And so, yes, we would have that conversation. The other thing that we did was when they were older and in high school, and Bill can talk to this because he's talked about this before here, is you need to be ahead of the curve when it comes to sexuality and the information your kids get about sex. So you need to, because the first thing they hear about sex is the thing they believe, no matter if it's true or not. And so if you're not the first one to tell them the truth about sex, then they're going to hear it from their friends at school, and it's not going to be accurate, probably. And it doesn't matter how you go back and talk to them about what's really true, they're always going to remember the first thing. So our dinner table, we talked about sex a lot. And a lot of it came from the classes they were taking in high school. There was one teacher at Wilsonville High School, I don't think he's there any longer, but he was an anarchist, a self-proclaimed anarchist. And we would always sit around the dinner table and say, we didn't try to keep our kids out of that class, because he would provoke conversations in class that then we could have a conversation about it at the dinner table, and do it with a Christian worldview rather than a secular worldview. But we needed to know what they were hearing. And so we would say, so what did DG talk about in class today? And it was amazing conversations we had about sexuality, about sex, about all sorts of things. So don't be afraid to let them ask questions. Now, make it age appropriate. And when they ask questions, make sure you give age appropriate answers. You don't have to go into great detail. Give them a little bit of an answer, and if they ask more questions, then give them a little bit more. But they're going to be satisfied early on. They're going to be like, ooh, gross, and walk away, or whatever. So.
Yeah, there are some great resources out there for parents, and what I may do when I pass the mic, I may look up the one that we used. Was it? Yeah. Okay, so it's Stanton Jones. He's former provost at Wheaton College. They wrote a series of books. So there's one for preschoolers. And it's like, a daddy and a mommy come together, they get married, and God blesses them with a baby kind of thing, and the baby comes out, and they love the baby, and so forth. And then as they get a little bit older, it goes, so gradually there's more biology, and then there's more of the emotional, relational components that come in. So there's a number of things out there that are available. Donna mentioned high school. I was a youth pastor for 5 years. At that point in time, I was teaching some sexuality stuff to high schoolers. This is back in the late 80s. I knew that we needed to be doing it with our middle schoolers, but our church wouldn't let us. When I was in college in 1979, I was coaching an age group swim team for girls ages 8 to 14. This is in 1979. And the conversations on the bus going to the swim meets, most of those girls who grew up upper middle class, Catholic, strong Catholic neighborhoods, so they were all going to Mass on Sunday, their first sexual encounters between the ages of 10 and 12. At dances at the local church on the weekends. My point is this: you've got to have these conversations way before you want to. You just do. And now with social media, if they have access to anything on the internet, first of all, don't let any of them on social media until they're 28. And then secondly, we just know it's bad. I mean, we've got truckloads of research on how bad social media is for people and their mental health. But they're going to get exposed to stuff, so you just have to stay out there ahead of it. As Donna said, the first thing you hear about something is what you will tend to believe, and it's much harder to convince them that it's not that way. I had to work on my daughter about the difference between a mean, median, and mode because her teacher had taught it wrong. I'm like, that's not right. She goes, well, my teacher taught me this way. I'm like, your teacher's wrong. I've taught statistics. This is not what a mean, median, mode is. So you've got to have those conversations early on. But I think part of the conversation from a Christian perspective, and it sounds like it's already been talked about in the conferences, sex is a wonderful gift from God. It's amazing. It's fantastic, right? There are things that reproduce asexually in our world. God didn't have to do it this way. Not only did he make it this way, but he made it a lot of fun to do it this way, right? Because the pleasure centers of the brain did not have to activate in order for this to happen. They just didn't. But God decided to make it this way. So the conversation is God did this incredible thing, made this wonderful thing, but it's so powerful. He knew that it had to happen in a safe context. And the context that he created for that was a marriage. And outside of that context, it's kind of like a nuclear reaction without the lead rods to kind of manage the reaction, right? So we've got this wonderful thing, but you want to keep it here. When I'm talking with adolescents, and young adults at the college, I'll talk about sex as being emotional superglue, right? It binds you together in a way that's really, really strong. So if you do that just kind of casually, that's a problem. A friend of mine was talking to his son. He said, you don't leave your soul at the door. meaning you bring all of you into the room with you when you do it. So it's stuff like that you have 18 years or so, right? So you're gradually teaching as opportunities come up and coaching your kids into the way that I think God wants us to live. And they may choose to follow that or not choose to follow that. But it's our job as parents to try to train them in the way that we think Scripture teaches people to go.
I like that Bill said that, because when working with, I heard one pastor said it this way: when you're outside that context of marriage, having sex and giving yourself away, culture says that's okay, but have safe sex, have safe sex, have safe sex. And he said, but there's no condom for the soul. And I think that's a way of saying that there's more involved in that, which God intended for that to be. And the safest place he desires for that. It's so powerful, so amazing, so good. And I think I love that. That's the legacy we want to pass on to kids. You guys want to add anything? I'm going to move us to any other questions. Is there anything you guys want to add to that? Greg and Lynn over there?
I'm going to plug a book.
Yeah, go
that's
for
back
it.
there. She actually spoke here 4 or 5 years ago, Julie Slattery, Rethinking Sexuality. I've just recently rediscovered it. It's mind-blowing that God created this. And I am very adamant about distinguishing between sex. This is going to be kind of tacky, but animals have sex, and I am not an animal. Biologically, yes, but I am not an animal. There has to be more to it than that. He created it. Why did he create it? And rethinking sexuality as a covenant relationship between our spouses and our God, and that whole naked in the garden was awesome. If you are looking for a book to take home, I would highly recommend that. That's her entire ministry, is getting us to rethink our sexuality the way God intended it to be in the first place. And it's exciting. It's exciting. And I would recommend that.
That's good. That's great advice. We're going to move towards wrapping up, but did
Yes,
you
we
guys
are.
have anything you wanted to close with? This was your guys'
I think
session.
I'll be
Jen's
honest.
session.
I don't know that I always did this well. I think that there are things I wish I'd said differently in my conversations with my girls, because we had girls, so it all fell on me. It didn't all fall on me. Gary had conversations too, but a lot of it fell on me. The one thing that I would say I think I did well, is I told them they could ask me any question. Details about Dad and I were the only thing off the table. Two of the girls really rarely had questions, and I had to force them to have conversations, and the other one really took me up on it. So, but I think it was far more open of a conversation for me and our girls than it ever was for me in the home I grew up in. So, also just to loop back to the sex advice, someone texted me this, and I think it's good to share. Talk a lot, laugh a lot, and lube a lot. Super practical. Just
Hey, straight up, when I do premarital couples, I tell them that. I've had more guys and ladies come back from the honeymoon going, thank you. Anyways, I would say we're going to wrap up. I feel like I want to pray into this, actually. This is something I want to pray into. But the last thing that we haven't talked about, and it's come up in a few of the questions on here. Somebody asked her questions about the expectations around climaxing. And those are really important questions, because here's where this is coming from. This is really important. We need to talk about this. Expectations. And this is where you have to talk about as a couple, figure those things out. Don't take yourself too serious as you're stumbling through these things, as you're figuring these things out. But I would say this when it comes to expectations. Two things that have made it hard for marriages when it comes to expectations. Number one is porn. Because porn has created unrealistic expectations. We haven't said that yet. And I think, and both porn is for men and women, because that's on the rise now with women, not just men. Actually, pornography is increasing more amongst women than it has been typically for men. But that creates these like expectations in your mind, right? Like, oh, this is what it's supposed to look like, right? And so and we've been so down on pornography, which we are, absolutely. But what pornography does, it creates an unrealistic expectation, right? It creates fantasies that are unrealistic, paid actors, actresses, and so forth. So it's not dealing with reality, and so that skews the expectations. I will say this, another place where I've seen a skewing of expectations, and I'll say this with all due respect, but Hallmark and Lifetime is emotional porn. What I mean by that is, and all the ladies are like, oh, and dudes are like, thank you for saying this, but because you watch that and you're like, this is that fantasy. So both create these unrealistic fantasy expectations where then you're just left with disappointment. So,
Mike, can I say something else too? Christian fiction also, and romance novels also. So, Amish romance novels.
Yes, very specifically.
My mother, we go to, we're moving her, and I'm like, boxes and boxes and boxes of Amish romance novels. I had no idea this genre existed. And what I found out is it's all the romance, but none of the sex, which is what my mom wanted.
Well, also, Christian sex books, at least the ones written in the 80s, were really, really bad. Because they would say the goal of sex is to climax simultaneously. And that is a lie. Yeah. Do not get caught in that. It doesn't matter. Do it when it happens. I mean, it might happen with one first and the other second. You figure it out, but don't put that kind of expectations on yourself.
I feel like for Greg and for you guys, I know you guys have a powerful story, which you haven't got to be able to tell all of that, but it's a story of redemption, and it's a story of hope. And I want to do two things. I want to encourage any couples here that are walking through some of this where it's hard, maybe there's been some brokenness, and just you have your own story. I would love if you guys are okay with that. Brad said I could, so reach out to you guys. And you guys can connect. Where's the best way to do that? What's the contact info for you guys?
I put cards on the back.
Okay.
For our ministry.
Great.
Call, email. And I have a website.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I am not involved in our ministry. I work full-time outside the home. That has nothing to do with what Greg does full-time in the home with this ministry. So I'm delighted to talk with you, but I'm not a professional. I have no initials behind my name. I just have some life experiences.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. Fantastic. Did you want to say something?
No?
You still, she's vitally involved in our ministry. We do have, go to our website, ladies especially. I deal mostly with men for obvious reasons. But if you have questions, we have an open Q&A Zoom meeting on Wednesday nights. 4:30 every Wednesday. See, I'm there, but if you just want Lynn, you just want a woman's perspective, a betrayed woman's perspective who has come through hell and back and says that we're thriving. Those are her words. But you just want to talk, Wednesday nights at 4:30, you can go to my website, createdtobefree.org, click the button, it'll walk you through it all. Technology's lovely, and come and talk to Lynn. Guys, you can just call me.
Thank you for that. Here's what I'd love to do. I just felt as we were up here, I just felt the Spirit said pray. Pray over you guys and pray over your intimacy in your marriages. And I want to speak words right now of life, hope, and healing. There may be some of you here that have had really traumatic sexual experiences, things have happened to you, things maybe you've done and you regret. Whatever that is, we have a God of redemption. God can take anything that's broken, and I want to just cast out any shame here. And I want to cast out, I think in the areas of sexuality is sometimes where we carry the most shame. And so I want to speak over everybody here that God loves you, that God is a redemptive God, and that there's hope, there's healing. And I want to bless your intimacy in your marriages. So will you guys just pray? God, thank you for this time. Thank you, Lord, for what Jen shared. Thank you for what this panel shared. We thank you for the questions. Jesus, I know you're the God of redemption, you're the God of beauty, the God of restoration. And Jesus, you came, and when you went to the cross for our healing, you went for our healing in all areas of our wholeness. And so, Jesus, I think of the room right now when we talk specifically about intimacy, everything from the trust that may have been broken, everything from our past and the shame, unmet expectations, questions, places where we're incompatible with each other, all those challenges and difficulties. Jesus, I believe that you can restore and heal, that you can bring something beautiful even from ashes. And so I pray over every marriage that's here. I pray for every single person, wherever their journey has been and their journey forward. I pray blessing, I pray hope, I pray healing. And Jesus, I pray that you would script in all of us the story of beauty that you've created for us, that you have in store for us. So I just want to bless everybody here in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Justin, come on up, bud. Thank you, guys. Would you give it up for the panel?